Thank you. So I'm a mathematician by training, so I thought I'd talk a little bit about math and how it would relate to blockchains. And there's actually more than I'll have time to talk about, but luckily I planned that ahead of time. So a little bit about me. I have a PhD from Purdue University. That PhD was in algebraic geometry, which I think is a wonderful subject. And so that would make me a mathematician slash teacher. And in the past 5 or 7 years, I've flirted with industry such as Dash. And I'm happy kind of going back and forth between industry and teaching. So I research for Dash currently. I'm doing some teaching projects. Right now, I'm trying to improve algebra education to high school aged students. And I'm also developing a blockchain course for ASU, as was mentioned. And a lot of what I've included in this presentation is based on kind of reflecting on this process of developing a blockchain course. This is a collaborative effort with faculty members at ASU, as well as we have a grad student and an undergrad that are helping us as well. So generally what I want to talk about, kind of an overview of what I want to present to you is a general mathematical magic, which is kind of what I had in mind when I submitted this talk. Then we'll break into the concept of a blockchain. I think it's really appropriate for such a conference where we've heard the word blockchain used lots and lots, so you're going to hear it a lot more. And I'll shortly spend some time talking about blockchain components, but in the interest of time, I'll focus on stable Nash equilibriums, which is actually more back to the math, or at least one mathematical approach to studying things. And I think it's really interesting, and so I hope you end up agreeing with me. And then I end with a hypothesis. So there is some speculation in this talk, but hopefully I'll make it clear what's known and kind of what may be. Okay, so general mathematical magic. So when you're developing a blockchain course, there's a lot of things to talk about. So some examples of some things that we want to include in a course include hash functions and applications. So this is the idea of a digital fingerprint. And actually an application of hash functions is Merkle trees. And Merkle trees allow 256 bits in a block header to basically tell you about all the transactions in a block. That makes the mining consistent. So if you have a bigger block, you don't have to work harder to mine it, things like that. And really, and that's an idea back from the 70s. So it's kind of amazing. You kind of cement a list in stone with 256 bits. So that's what a Merkle tree is. There's Bloom filters. Bloom filters are kind of the same thing, but instead of a list where you have a specific order, a Bloom filter just gives you an idea, is this in a set? It's similar, you just don't have a specific order. Is this included, is this not? Bloom filters are not explicitly used in the Bitcoin protocol, but there are services that rely on Bloom filters and some higher level things of how Bitcoin works that could use Bloom filters, for example, X-thin blocks. And then kind of what led me mathematically to study this is public and private keys, digital signatures. Bitcoin uses the elliptic curve digital signature algorithm. The reason it uses that algorithm is because it's quick. It's very easy for computers to sign and check signatures as well. And something I'm really interested in now, but I expect it to be brought into Bitcoin type protocols at some point, but it's not currently implemented, and that's inverse Bloom lookup tables. But that's something our research is having us look into. Just basically, we're following some work actually done in Massachusetts, not at MIT, but we're interested in inverse Bloom lookup tables, and they tell you kind of about a set, but also how sets vary. And so you can kind of pick out what's different, and that's the value of an inverse Bloom lookup table. And then the last topic, blockchain. I put a question mark because is this really one of the most valuable, magical things? And I'm hoping that you can draw your own conclusion on that question. But to kind of shed light on this, we should talk about the question, what is a blockchain? Okay, so what is a blockchain? So my intention is to give you an idea of a blockchain. So I'm big on this allegory of the cave where, you know, there's these shadows on the wall, and sometimes the guy breaks out of the cave and realizes the shadows are actually part of a much bigger concept of the people dancing in front of the fire or whatever. So I'm hoping that you can see at the end of this, I'm hoping you can kind of envision a blockchain as a shadow of either one or several very deep ideas, okay? So that's kind of where we're going. And so here's a first definition of blockchain. Okay, okay, okay. Blockchain is a buzzword used so that people who don't have an understanding of this word will throw money at ill-defined projects, okay? So this is a definition. I hear this word blockchain, especially the way I even used it. What is blockchain, right? It's not, there's no indefinite article, there's no definite article. It's, what is it, a noun? Is it a verb? What? So I'm using that definition here. Now, I understand that definition is somewhat critical, and if you don't like that definition, don't worry, I've got 3 more. So you get to take your pick. Okay, so let's look at another definition. So here's a naive definition of blockchain. So that's information which is secured by hash functions by an ever-increasing proof of work. Okay, so when I first heard that blockchain is going to change the world, well, I kind of had an understanding of how all this blockchain worked, and blockchain's going to change the world, and I was like, this is what I thought a blockchain was, and I'm like, well, that doesn't seem like it's going to change the world. And yes, this is the property that provides immutability, but technically with digital signatures, you could have information that was very difficult to mutate already. So it doesn't seem like this is going to change the world, this one definition, okay? And when we're asking what people mean when people say blockchain will change the world, it's important to know what the definitions are. Mathematicians, we have to worry about what the definitions are. If we don't define what we're talking about, we can't argue and draw any conclusions at all. So we need to define this. Okay, I promised you 2 more definitions. Boom, boop. Let's see, there you go. Okay, so here's a general definition of blockchain, and this is my favorite, my personal favorite. Okay, and that's, this definition is that a blockchain is information that is batched into blocks. Each block includes a hash of the previous block to form a linear chain. The information in each block provides instructions to update an agreed upon global state, okay? This is similar to the previous one, but I like this definition because this definition is application agnostic. This is like a definition you would use as the minimal scaffolding in your brain when you're trying to build a project. I think that a lot of focus has been put on the currency application, and while I think that's a great application, and I work on the currency application, I do want to see that pushed through to its whatever its endpoint is. I'm very excited about the currency application. There could be other applications, and we shouldn't just think of one thing and ignore maybe possible other value that could be brought in. And I bold these words, agreed upon, because that emphasizes what Satoshi did in his paper. What Satoshi did was allow multiple computers to agree on information and know they agreed upon it, right? When they say consensus network, that's what the consensus is. When they say, the fancy term would be that Satoshi came up with a solution to the Byzantine generals problem, which technically is a math problem. So that's fun. Okay, so this is what you would want to use to explore non-currency applications, and to try to bring this down to earth. Oh, I hit the wrong button. Maybe. Yeah, there we go. Whoops, that's the wrong one. Okay. So to bring this back down to earth, the global state in Bitcoin, because I never defined what that is, would be the unspent transaction outputs. Okay, so that's really what is in agreement on the Bitcoin network. And I'm using Bitcoin kind of abstractly. It doesn't have to be that one. Could be Dash. Okay, and very last definition. Okay, and I'm calling this the working definition of blockchain. So sometimes you need to forget about your disputes on what a definition is, and this is when we're going to work, this is what we're going to use. And you can choose differently, that's fine. In my opinion, there's not a clear consensus on the network of what a blockchain is. So consensus in the literature of what the blockchain is. Anyway, so here's the working definition. A blockchain is data batched together in blocks secured over an ever-increasing proof of work, right, which is that naive definition, along with all the tools that allow Bitcoin to function, right? So now this definition is more practical because I really shoved a lot of cool stuff under the rug, it's just that mathematical magic and more, but it's a less precise definition. And I could have filled up this whole slide with words, and we might have made this precise. But anyway, okay, but let's not do that. Okay, and this is basically the definition we used for a course development, right? When you develop a course, you have to have something to talk about, and this kind of gives you a very clear scope of what to talk about. So let's talk about this working definition of a blockchain. So here's some working blockchain components, right? So all the stuff that lets Bitcoin work. Okay. So there's consensus rules, right? So the consensus rules determine what makes a block valid or invalid, and that basically tells you how you can update the global state, the UTXO, or not update it, or somebody tries to steal money, the signature is not valid, to drop that, the whole block if necessary, to make sure the rules are enforced. Governance. Governance is what a blockchain provides. There's these rules that are enforced by the computers, and somebody could put up a node, a computer that's running completely different rules, but the entire rest of the network might reject that if it's outside of the rules that are intended for the whole network. So you have kind of basically a self-enforcing governance. There's protocol forking. You can change the rules, right? Change the governance. And if people don't agree on the way the governance should change, then you might end up with a chain fork. And a chain fork is what happened in Bitcoin. Now there's the type of people that want to keep everything on an actual blockchain, and that's with Bitcoin Cash, and the people who want to somehow bring in off-chain solutions, as they call them, and they want to continue to be called Bitcoin. So there we go. There's scripting that's definitely used in Bitcoin, and I could spend time talking about all these, but I really want to focus on the concept of a stable Nash equilibrium. Okay. Anyway, so that's a concept from math. So here's a definition. So a stable Nash equilibrium exists in a game when any player that alters their strategy will play at a less optimal strategy, okay? Now, Bitcoin works at a stable Nash equilibrium, and this is a concept from game theory. Now, when I first say game theory, you think checkers, you think chess, you think things like that, maybe cards, but game theory applies to lots of situations, right? And when we have a network and there's these miners and there's these nodes, these computers that are running are the nodes, there are all these actors that are doing that. You can treat it like there's a bunch of people playing a game, and with something like Bitcoin, you can say, well, the amount of Bitcoin you acquire, the amount of money you have, is your score, right? And you can talk about who did well playing the game and who did poorly, right? And even though it's not a game, it's real life, the same theory that would apply to games would apply to this situation. So, good. So let's talk about this stable Nash equilibrium of Bitcoin. Okay, now, Bitcoin actually operates with a much stronger property. So first I wanted to tell you that it's at a stable Nash equilibrium, but it's actually really strong, okay, what the thing is. So now, when I say really strong, I don't think there is a name for it out in the literature. There could be something I don't know, but with Bitcoin, an attacker with less than 50% or 33% of the network hash power has a vanishing probability of doing better than an honest mining attack, than honest mining by the network, right? You're not going to make as much. If you had like 25% of the hashing power and you try to use that hashing power to attack the network, most likely, almost certainly, you are going to either not make any money or make less money than you could have made if you just applied that hashing power to enforce the rules that are expected to be enforced by the network, okay? Now, I'll put the 33% in there because there's this thing that's called the selfish mining attack, and technically, that wouldn't really, that wouldn't allow you to double spend or anything generally, but if you did have 33% of the network, you could put yourself at an advantage, and that might drive other people away, and then you could maybe creep up to 50%, which would be in this category. Okay, and so if somebody does attack the network, they have a vanishingly small chance of success. Now, there is a little bit of liberal application of language with this. I'm saying vanishingly small. I didn't tell you what I meant by that. But basically, if you want to reverse a transaction, the further and further you go back in the chain, the less likely it becomes. And if you have, so that's where you get vanishingly small, and that would be well defined in math. And like if you try to change something in the last block and you have 40% of the hash power, well, you're going to have a 40% chance of actually catching up, but then you got to get lucky again to get ahead, and most likely the rest of the network, that 60% of the network, is going to come up with a block before you can come up with two. The attacker can come up with two, and the attacker should probabilistically keep falling behind. So that's what I mean by vanishingly small chance. Should, and does, but anyway. So now, when I started to bring up game theory, I was like, well, people don't know what game theory is. So I thought, well, let's compare it to other games. So there's this thing called the prisoner's dilemma, where the police catch two people that may have committed the same crime, I don't know, and they do this, and then iterated prisoners, and if they cooperate, if they all don't tell the police anything, they get off kind of lightly, but if one of them tells the police about it and the other one doesn't, the one that tells gets an easy punishment while the other one gets a harsh punishment, and if they both tell, they both get harsh punishments. So, and then if you do this over and over, where the prisoner's dilemma, or they keep having the same thing happen over and over, it's a studied case, and tit for tat is a strategy that works well in many cases. That's where if you tell on me, I'm going to tell on you the next time, and so on. So this tit for tat actually works out, so people just keep their mouth shut, and everybody, that's the optimal solution for both parties. But with this, it's always best to tell on the other person if they don't tell on you. I mean, just if you're trying to not be in jail. Okay, okay. And this strategy, the tit for tat, is largely cooperative, but not completely. Okay, and so the application of the Lightning Network. The Lightning Network, which you might have heard about on Bitcoin, replaces the stable Nash equilibrium provided by Satoshi by a tit for tat solution. And if you actually analyze the game, it might be a little bit altered from, you know, the pristine versions of these games, but there's something called a punishment, or you might call a punishment transaction in the Lightning Network, so that if like somebody tries to publish a fraudulent transaction, then you can somehow punish them, and that's like a tit for tat situation. And so I think that some of the beauty of the original Bitcoin blockchain is being lost by the branch that's called Bitcoin today. Anyway, so wider applications. This is really one I want to talk about. Finding, and this is not well defined, very stable Nash equilibriums could have applications too. And this is where the hypothesis is, could, right? Could. So I'm hypothesizing criminal justice, foreign policy, social cooperation, economic actors and systems. We're kind of already seeing that in Bitcoin. And I'm sure there could be other applications that we don't know about. And when I'm saying very stable Nash equilibriums, I'm just saying that, you know, if we could change the game we play, if we change the way we work or the rules that we have, maybe instead of like a tit for tat, like criminal justice, like you rob a bank, you go to jail, right? That's tit for tat. And you know, drug laws, it's like maybe a tit for a tat, right? If you commit if you break a drug law, you might have a retribution. So in those type situations, if we could figure out how to make it so that tit for tat is not a largely cooperative solution, but actually get a fully cooperative solution that people want to do, not force them. This is where the applications could. And when I say applications, it's just changing the game. It doesn't necessarily have to do with a computer network. And so I'll leave you with the success of blockchain could be considered more a statement about humans and their interactions than a computer technology. So thank you. Do you have any questions? In the back. So the question is, could I address the claim that a blockchain is immutable from a mathematical standpoint? Okay, so let's say we go back a year in the chain. Will you grant me that? Okay, then from that block that came out a year ago, there's been blocks on top of it. And each block on top of it had a certain amount of work, a certain amount of computer guessing. And with cryptography, we assume that's pretty much the only way you can try to solve these problems is to guess. And so the computer would guess, and if one actor was actually trying to recreate this chain with the same, and do the same amount of guesses, to come up with an appropriate proof of work that would somehow overtake the main chain, this would be quite difficult. The amount of energy it would take, you can calculate, and it would be quite astounding the amount of energy it would take just to catch up. And if the attacker, the person trying to change the block a year ago, ever did catch up, by the time they catch up, there'd be most likely more than half a year to build on top of that, because people keep running their computers to keep the thing going. If for some reason people lose interest in the project and nobody runs their computers and nobody mines, then it would be possible eventually to overtake the main chain, although the amount of energy it takes might actually cause you to question the sanity of the person that does it. So I think that addresses your question. Uh-huh. Old guys rule? The older I was, the better I get. Yeah. Right. So yeah, so there was a comment about like the next block or the most recent block found, and there also seemed to be a comment about basically a transaction that's not in a block. And certainly if a transaction is not in a block, then it's not secured by a blockchain yet. And if it's in the last block, we can calculate the probability of doing that. So like if an attacker had 40% of the hashing power, then I think there's like a 16% chance of undoing the last block or something. Yeah, this is very rough. I'll have to check. There's a couple branches in this thing. Maybe it's a little bit more, but certainly less than 40%, right? And then if it's 2 back, we would multiply by 0.4, and then 3 back, another 0.4, and then 4 back, another 0.4. That's so as we go back and back and back, the actual chance of this attacker overtaking the network goes down. So there you go. Of all the money. Yes, which is incredible on most of these networks. Yeah, so yeah, that's a credit. Yeah, you're not really going to have an attacker doing that. Perhaps a state actor might do that. Perhaps, I don't know.
So it seems intuitive that, the old guy theory, the farther back it is, the more secure it is. How does that, you said that the proof of work also increases. Is that true?
Well, the proof of work, the actual amount of hashes you need, the way Bitcoin, the way Dash works, is that the more people hash, the harder it gets. Like you've got to guess more times to statistically be able to find a block, the more people guess. And it's also set up that the less people, let's say people stop mining, like I hear that some particular coin might have had their price drop, and now somebody running a miner doesn't cover their energy costs, and they'll turn off. And the protocol set up that the difficulty will decrease, so you need fewer guesses to get the next block as fewer people are on it or on the network, and less power is on the network, right? So that's one thing. So you could see the price drop, and then the hash power goes down, and then somebody that didn't have 50% all of a sudden would in the back. That's right. About the research group? The technology. So, yeah, so right now, well, I joined, I was concerned about, I just want a currency to scale to global use. And I thought Dash was a very good project to join in with. And so the first thing we did was raise the maximum block size to 2, so we doubled the throughput. And then the second, and now we're running simulations. And the simulations are trying to pinpoint where the breaking point of the network would be. How big do the blocks, if the big blocks were this big, would the network start to fragment or something, right? And one thing I asked them to consider when they're doing their simulations is the way the propagation worked, okay? So we've been studying what we call traditional propagation, where there's a new block and it's just served to all the peers. And so if it's a megabyte block, you have a megabyte of bandwidth. We're studying compact blocks, which is currently on the Bitcoin network, that has kind of shortened names of the transactions, and then it's up to the node to reconstruct the block on the other side. We're looking at XThin, which is, it sends a Bloom filter, that was on the first slide, to tell you about the mempool of a transaction. So one of a node, so there's one node that says, I would like a block. Here's a Bloom filter of my memory pool. And the node with the block will run all the transactions in the block against that Bloom filter and be able to predict which transactions the node that wants the block doesn't have. And that's kind of the magic thing, be able to predict, like, oh, this one you're missing it. And with XThen, you'll send the instructions to construct the block, but also any transactions you're pretty sure, you know that the other node is missing, right? So that stops kind of like a packet. Like with packets, if you get a drop packet, it has to get resent, and that's what slows things down. So that's the idea behind XThen. It gets that one part that slows everything down the most. It takes care of that. And then we're also looking at graphene, which is a new thing. I believe that's based on a paper which is on GitHub by Gavin Andreessen that's called On O1 Block Propagation. And that is using not only a Bloom filter, but an inverse Bloom lookup table, so that you can use a Bloom filter that has a false positive rate. However, the inverse Bloom filter, inverse Bloom lookup table will actually be able to help you identify what false positives happened. And it's great. So you read Gavin Andreessen's paper, that's where it started, and there's been work since then, if you're interested in that. So that's the main thing we've been pursuing basically this last year, is making simulations with all those propagation things and determining where the breaking point is for all of those. Question? Mm-hmm. I believe, so the thing is how the game's set up, okay? So with a certain type of game, like this Prisoner's Dilemma, that game's set up so the only stable Nash equilibrium is both tell on each other, okay? However, that's the least optimal solution for both people, right? The best thing would be to cooperate and not tell, okay? But anyway, so that's kind of what this game was thought of. Now, with the blockchain game, it's a completely different game. And so different games will have different equilibrium. So I think the only equilibrium in the Prisoner's Dilemma is both tell. For the iterated version, I don't know if there is a stable Nash equilibrium. But tit for tat has been shown to be pretty good against most strategies, and although there are some problems with it, and there are a few others that are somehow considered to be better, but it's hard to say it's better because it kind of depends on the strategy of the opponent, right? So basically, if you set up the rules so they behave in a certain way, you get different preferred outcomes just by the actors, and you don't need to enforce that, hey, don't spend money you don't have, or you don't need to enforce these rules because everybody just will abide by them. And that's kind of what Bitcoin allows you to do. And so, any other questions? I think 1 minute left. So very last question, if there is one. Yep.
Just sort of speculative, how might you see an auction on a blockchain being designed?
How might I envision an auction design? Well, it would depend on the blockchain. So, like Ethereum, you would design it one way, and if you were making a completely new chain, you would design it another way. But on Ethereum, you could have a contract that has you're auctioning off a token, and I mean, you're going to have to ask a coder, but I'm pretty sure you could have some type of function that you use to that the customer use. I'll just call them customers. Customer would use to tie up their funds and say, yes, I will buy this. And then somebody else could say, yes, I will buy this with more funds, and yes, I will buy this with more funds, until eventually maybe a certain block height happens and the contract executes, and then the trade happens. So I think that should be possible. If you did this on Ethereum, I don't know what the gas cost would be or such, but I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about that. So, good. All right, so thank you very much.